Thanks, Doreen. That's a great crowd. And I think there's lunch, too. That's wonderful. Madam Chair, Minister Webster, members of the Board of Directors, National President Marie, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, if they're here, boys and girls, members all. Thanks for coming out and sharing in celebration of the Centennial of the Women's Institute on Prince Edward Island. If we were coming out to an event like this 100 years ago, we probably would have come on the train into the city, and we would likely, I don't want to use that.
There's a few in the back that were short.
Oh, so they can't hear with this one.
No, that's actually just
Oh, okay, I'll use this. We would probably come on the train and we'd be spending the night here in the city. Or we might have hitched up our favorite driving horse, and we would have, depending on the road conditions, all of which were unpaved, we would be on a sleigh or a carriage, and we would have come into the city. We certainly wouldn't have come by automobile because it's Thursday, and Thursday is market day, and in 1913, cars were not allowed on the road on Thursdays. Or Tuesdays, that was also market day. The government at the time was struggling with the issue of these automobiles. There were all of 7 in 1908, and by the end of the First World War, there were 700 and some. But in 1913, when the Women's Institute was organized, the government was struggling with the issue of the automobile. What to do? There was a lobby in favor, and there was a very, very strong lobby against. The government decided that they would play the middle of the road, and there were Tuesdays and Thursdays for no automobiles. You see, there was a horse for every 3 islanders, and there were 109,000 islanders. So the horses certainly dominated. The government decided to hold a plebiscite. Each community could vote. I read in the records of the Meadowbank Women's Institute in June of 1913, there was a unanimous resolution that they were absolutely opposed to any automobile on island roads in this province. It was unanimous. That was their 3rd meeting. The Women's Institute, I expect, and there were, by the end of the war, there were 40 institutes, but at the beginning of the war, there were 21. And I expect that most of those women's institutes were opposed to the automobile. By 1919, it was a thing of the past, and the automobile was here to stay. So if we were traveling, we would not be using the automobile on this night in 1913. We would, among us, there would be, of the population on the island, only 3,900 of the women would have been gainfully employed outside the home as wage earners. It was a different world. It was certainly a time when the schools of the province were largely neglected. There were in place legislation that was over 50 years. Back in the 1850s, it was designed for the schools and had never been updated. And that legislation provided the curriculum, which was spearheaded mainly by mathematics and learning about Greek and Latin literature. It didn't really prepare you for dairy farming. And so there was a huge exodus of young men from the island. 10% of our population left in the first decade. So the institute that was established here on Prince Edward Island in 1913 certainly had no difficulties finding issues to relate to and challenges to deal with. And so those first institutes sort of set the tone for this island and for the legacy that our institute celebrates 100 years later. That night, if we came in here, we probably would have met at Prince of Wales College, although there was a building under construction because of federal money. It was known as the Agricultural Hall, and it was going to serve the farmers and the fledgling new institute. It was going to be built on Fitzroy Street, and it would offer space for meetings, space for offices, and space for the courses that the women would take when they came by train to learn some of the skills that were needed to be good mothers, good housewives, be able to raise the children in the way that they wanted to. And so these courses helped them to learn such basics as how to can chicken, how to can vegetables, how to set a table properly, and all those things that we take for granted now. Those were taught, and that building was under construction, as well as one in Summerside, known as the Agricultural Hall. You see, the federal government provided a huge grant of money in 1913. The grant was intended to stimulate proper scientific approaches to agriculture so that the industry on Prince Edward Island and all across Canada could be bolstered by farmers who not only had the ability in terms of the skill to do it, but that they also had the knowledge that they could farm with understanding of breeding animals, of proper nutrition for animals. And so that grant was largely for the agricultural industry, but there was a portion of it siphoned off to establish institutes across the country. And on Prince Edward Island, for those first 4 years, 13 through 17, there was $10,700 set aside to organize institutes. And it was with that money that people like Ethel Dunbrack was hired, a graduate of Fanny Farmer School, and Catherine James, a young girl from Ontario who was a graduate of the Ontario Agricultural College. And they came here and spearheaded through meetings in the country, out through the country in various places. They held meetings to speak to the ladies and to the men of the district about the merits of establishing a women's institute. There was already a farmers' institute. That was the equivalent. It was dating back into the late 1800s, and by 1913 there were about 45 farmers' institutes on the island. Indeed, it was the Excelsior Farmers' Institute in York that sponsored the very first meeting for a women's institute in that community in 1911. So that's somewhat of the background to the way this island was in 1913. That's a very quick snapshot of what the island was like in 1913 when the institute was established. The women of the rural areas were basically lonely people. Helen Herring, one of the great pillars of our island for work in the Women's Institute and many other areas where she invested her ability and her time, spoke of the loneliness and the need for social contact that women in 1913 needed. And the Institute provided that social forum for them. It wasn't just an educational organization. It was also a social opportunity. And it has never lost a grip on that important element. Never. Still today, you have groups that religiously set aside a day a year at least to go out, not just for the opportunity to have a meal together, but to do something educational, but more importantly, to socialize. And that is something that was there from the get-go, and it still is. Their garden parties, their April Fool's parties, their leap year parties, all of the things that they did back in the early years, they're modernized now, but they still serve that basic function. So, what is a book launch? It's one of those kind of rare occasions. I was reflecting today. I wonder, what is a book launch anyway? Is it, well, I wasn't sure. I asked Catherine. I don't think I'll repeat what she said. But there was a former president of Nigeria who said that if you attend a book launch, you are bearing witness to the birth of new ideas. Well, I don't think in this project that you're going to find any new ideas. what you may find is a new interpretation of what has gone on over the past century with Women's Institute on Prince Edward Island. There have already been 3 histories written over the 100 years by other people. They serve as a record, and they bear witness to the interpretation that the writers at that time put on the events that they read about. And that's what I have done. If there is anything original in what the book contains, it might be captured in the title. The title is something that I arrived at early in the exercise, because it came clear to me that the successes of the Prince Edward Island Women's Institute were not accidental, that the organization early on developed an approach to meeting its challenges that is worthy of our not just honoring and celebrating, but of our serious consideration. Decision-making and putting together an action plan requires a certain set of skills. And it was clear to me in reading the old documents, the minutes of meetings, the board records, the newspapers reflecting on what institutes were doing, that there were 3 key elements in what the Women's Institute did. They recognized a need, whether it was a tuberculosis epidemic or troops serving overseas that needed comforts, or whether it was the condition of the local public school, or what it was. When they recognized a need, there was not a quick fix. I repeat, there was not a quick fix. And that's how all of us live these days, with the quick fix, whether it's going to the doctor and wanting an immediate answer, or whether it's taking your computer to the repairman and wanting it fixed quickly, or trying to fix it yourself. We're conditioned to this quick fix. The Institute rejected that approach. And so the critical second stage was reflection. And reflection is more than just taking time. It's researching. And so you see guest speakers at many meetings. When the development plan was the catchword back in the late 60s and early 70s, and organizations like the Women's Institute was struggling with how to deal with the development plan and its impact on society, they brought in guest speakers, many of whom were what we refer to on the island as outside experts, people from education, from the economy, from industry, and they spoke to the women and talked to them about what the future might hold and how it might look. And the women embraced that, and they moved with it. They reflected. They considered what was the best strategy to move forward, whatever the challenge might be. In the 20s, it was the epidemic of tuberculosis. And their fix was to change the attitude of islanders about tuberculosis and to convince government that a sanatorium was needed. The only province in Canada that didn't have one. And because of the footwork of the Women's Institute, all 183 branches across this province went out and canvassed their communities and persuaded people to sign petitions. 178 of 183 signed, asking for a sanatorium. That's part of the reflection process. That's part of discerning what is the best strategy. And then go ahead and do it. Respond. And so reflecting is important. Responding, of course, is important to get it done. Those 3 words capture what I think is, if it isn't the secret of their success, it certainly is the pattern of decision-making that they followed. One of the first set of records that I read, when I started this exercise a year ago, the first thing I did was go to the archives and read the newspapers from 1913 to 1915. I actually started in 1911 and read from then to 1915. And after that, the first set of records, it was It was just by coincidence, by accident really, but I chose the Women's Institute from Meadowbank, their records. There are 74 sets of records at the archives from Women's Institute on PEI. And out of that set of 74 records, I chose the ones that were there from Meadowbank, the early records. And Meadowbank was organized on April 7th, 1913. They were one of the earliest ones formed after Marshfield. And the first set of records, they decided something that, well, I chose a couple of quotes out of their records that I never found as good ones. Mrs. H.E. Roper was the secretary of Meadowbank, and bless her heart, she wrote excellent, excellent minutes. And she said that they were meeting in the school. Picture this, 1913, they're meeting in the schoolhouse. And it's a typical country school, the holes in the floor and scrubbed, never been scrubbed, perhaps for a year, and dark and dingy. And they decided right away that something needed to be done, that the best use they could make of their time as a new organization was to do something to improve the appearance of the school as well as the health of the school. It was unsanitary, poor nutrition. What did they do? We'll leave it over until the next meeting. Now, many of us would see that as putting it off, or, you know, come on, let's do it now. We'll leave it over until the next meeting. I don't know how many times, friends, that I read those words in minutes across this island, from Enmore to Kingsborough, from Ray of Hope to New London. We'll leave it over. Think about the power of that. It wasn't just so that a little clique of ladies in the month between could get together and decide what to do, but they would think about it. And for sure, at the next meeting, that topic would be returned to the agenda, and there would be some determined action. Might be a guest speaker to come in and talk about it, such as tuberculosis and how to prevent it, but they were going to leave it over, not to act too swiftly. That was my first inkling that this is a strategy the Women's Institute have. And I found it over and over in other records.